Good afternoon, everyone. Glad that some of you could make it back after a short break. We've got excellent workshops happening simultaneously this afternoon, but this is the most important and best one. So I'd like to introduce our speaker for this workshop is Dr. Daniel Sugenda. And Dr. Sugenda is from Cal State Stanislaus. He is the interim department chair of liberal studies, and he's an associate professor of liberal studies and teacher education there in the College of Education, Kinesiology, and Social Work. I met Dr. Sugenda through a webinar that he put on this summer with his colleagues from Stanislaus and in the community and partners in the community in that area. It was called Confronting White Supremacy in the K-12 Classroom. Supporting Black Lives Matter and anti-racist teaching. And I said, we have got to have him spread his words of knowledge with our community college faculty who are in education. So we're very grateful that you're here with us. I wanted to point out one of the exciting things that was a result of Daniel's webinar was he asked those of us that participated to sign a commitment form and fill it out that listed the action items that we would commit to engage in that confront racism. So that was a great little post-webinar activity to just go through that and think about what actions specifically am I going to take and sign that. So it was a great experience, Daniel, and I thank you for that. So in his presentation today, moving toward an anti-racist lens, confronting shortcomings and how we train future teachers, he's going to focus on the business as usual frameworks that have been used in the field of teacher education that continue to frame underserved student populations from a deficit perspective. And it's very related, Daniel, to the keynote speaker we had this morning, Dr. Regina Stambach-Stroud, where she talked about what that looks like primarily and how that's happening systemically in our education system and historically. And so I believe now Daniel's going to be able to answer some of our questions on, how do we do this differently? How do we elevate opportunities for all students in our K-12 classrooms through how we train our future teachers? So thank you, Daniel, for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Also, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, we'll take questions at the end, so please post your questions in the chat.
Well, thanks for that wonderful introduction, and thanks for having me here. I'm excited to do this session. Before we do get started, I'd like everyone to spend maybe 2 or 3 minutes. I'm going to put it in the chat. I just put it in right now. And it's a Padlet. And so what I'd like everyone to do is to, so hit escape if you're in full screen so that you can get to the link, the Padlet link. And just spend 2 or 3 minutes completing those, like responding to those questions. All you do if you haven't done Padlet before is you click on the little plus sign and then just like a little brief response to as many of those questions as you can. I think it'll sort of get us thinking about what it means to teach from an anti-racist lens and how it impacts our work as teachers and as teacher educators. So I'm going to give you like 2 minutes starting from right now, and I'm going to time it. And I'll be quiet just so that you can read through those and complete the Padlet. Got about a minute left. All right, so we're gonna get back to those Padlet responses. I'm gonna ask that you peek at them a little bit later. But if you can go back to the presentation so that you're actually seeing the slides that I'm looking at, it'd be helpful. But in order for us to get on the same page, I thought it might also be helpful if everyone at least here understands where I'm coming from, at least in how I'm defining what an anti-racist educator is and what an anti-racist educator actually does. Because I think that there are lots of different definitions as to what anti-racist teaching is. So I thought I'd just sort of lay that out first, because I've really thought about this deeply for a while now. And I've come to this conclusion that, anti-racist teaching is a combination of educational pedagogies, practices, and dispositions that are geared towards improving the educational outcomes of Black, Indigenous, and students of color, including the ways in which teachers celebrate diversity. So some people call this the heroes and holidays approach. And this is where teachers, um, support their students of color in the classroom by immediately looking to the student's race or ethnicity and then identifying heroes and holidays that they might relate to, and then sort of trying to build that into the curriculum. So that's one way. And also in the efforts that teachers make to make connections between instruction and curriculum with respect to students' cultural lives through culturally responsive teaching practices. And I think that these first 2 points, I think teachers are actually already doing it. And they're not just doing it like right now, like it's new. They've actually been doing it for a really long time, using this sort of heroes and holidays approach. And in some ways, it has been around for a while, but it's always not appropriate. I would say, I'm thinking back to like when I was a student, when I was in high school, no, I'm sorry, not high school, when I was in elementary school, I remember we were getting close to when it was Chinese New Year. And I remember my teacher went through all this effort to like sort of decorate the classroom and, read a story about what Chinese New Year was. And I was one of the only Asian American kids in my class at the time, I remember. And I remember that teacher looking at me when Chinese New Year actually was occurring and said, "Hey, Daniel, isn't this, tell us how your family celebrates Chinese New Year, because I did this because I really wanted to show something that your family might celebrate at home." And I looked at the teacher and I'm like, "We don't celebrate Chinese New Year because I'm not Chinese. Um, I'm actually Thai American. And so we have a very different New Year's that's actually falls on a different day than Chinese New Year. And so we don't even celebrate Chinese New Year." And so this assumption that the teacher made about me without actually getting to know me is really a good representation of how I think teachers sometimes approach this heroes and holidays approach without actually knowing deeply about their students. Um, and this is where we get to some of these other points now where I think, sure, I think teachers may have been attempting to do the first 2 points, but I think that there's a lot of, that these other points that are coming up are rather lacking, both in the K-12 classroom, and I would argue in teacher education programs too, in the classes that we're all teaching. With the first of these principles being this understanding of what a socially or racially just education looks like, whether it's like the curriculum choices that teachers make, such as the ways in which our country has extended to new forms of Jim Crow through the unfair or unequal treatment of Black people, or the ways in which the unethical, unfair, and disgusting treatment of Native and Indigenous people are sort of glossed over in the social studies or history textbooks that students learn about, especially right now as we get closer to Thanksgiving. So anti-racist educators are critical scholars. They really see, they're people who operate and see themselves as someone who functions from a critical lens, such that the curriculum, school policies, and even their own pedagogical practices are always confronted and audited to see if it's steeped in white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And they're also reflective about themselves, their positionality, and the unearned privileges that they might have, and how that privilege actually oppresses others, right? And they do so through things like normalizing Black joy and Black excellence, so that their Black students can regularly see themselves in the curriculum as something other than a slave. I was listening to this podcast not too long ago, and there was this whole argument from Bettina Love about how when kids in the classroom, when Black kids in the classroom open textbooks right now, or they enter into a curriculum, they primarily see themselves as a slave in that curriculum, and that how problematic that is. So anti-racist educators also understand how being non-racist or apolitical is not helpful for anyone. And in fact, is actually more damaging than someone who is racist, because at least at least I know what I'm getting from a racist educator, because they're very upfront about it. But from an educator who is a self-claiming anti-racist, we really have no idea what their real agendas are. And we get hurt when we feel they're on our side, but at the end of the day, consistently see this pattern of feeling constantly let down. Anti-racist teaching is the inclusion and relationship between all of these areas that I just sort of pointed out, and the normalization of them instead of treating them as an add-on. Because I think what happens right now is there's this treatment of equity, diversity, anti-racism as an add-on instead of normalizing it. Focusing on one or two areas in all of those points I just pointed out is not anti-racist teaching. Anti-racist teaching is a wholehearted attempt to address all of these areas. So why now? Why is it that when looking at maybe even this conference's agenda, why every session, almost every session, is somehow related to anti-racist teaching? To anti-racist teaching. Because, well, one would argue that the need for an anti-racist education has always been there. We've always needed it, but white educators, which historically make up about 84% of teachers in this country, were never really comfortable with checking how racism benefits them, and instead sort of deflects this discomfort by claiming to be non-racist, which is translated to being apolitical, where terms like racism and white supremacy and anti-Blackness don't actually exist or are never really examined. But then recently, George Floyd happened, right? During the pandemic, the murder of George Floyd happened. And white people, white educators especially, all over the country got angry and passionate and decided on their watch that they were ready to join the fight, that people of color have had to fight their entire lives, that fight of racism, right? And they took to the streets and they protested, and they made everyone feel like this might be a turning point. But then, and this is recently, right? The election happened. And remember that point I made earlier about how there's this pattern about that people of color feel like we're constantly trusting white folks and then we get let down. Well, to most people of color, and this is not a political statement because I'm sure that it's a fact if you actually were to look it up. Most people of color, for most people of color, Trump and that administration represents racism and oppression and white supremacy. And to know that about half of the country voted for him, more than in 2016, we will wake up every day. I will wake up every day and leave my house and go into the community and look around and be like, are you one of the people that voted for him? Are you racist? Are you going to hurt me? Am I safe around you? So that's where we are today, I think. And this is why this movement to being an anti-racist educator is even more important than some of the things that have happened just this year. Right now, more so than ever before, because for people of color, and particularly our Black, Brown, and Asian American students in particular, don't feel safe. So how do you do this? Well, I think that to think about what is needed to help our candidates move along this continuum from being from being racist, either consciously or unconsciously, and performing actions that might intentionally or unintentionally oppress others. They need to move from that place to a place where they can be explicitly anti-racist and acknowledging that, yes, there are teaching strategies that I was trained in that are anchored in white supremacy, and realizing that they need to actually confront it. So in order for you to help you think through this first step, reflecting, unpacking, and recognizing, go back and take a look at the Padlet responses. Look at what you wrote, what other people wrote on that other tab. Because now I want to sort of look at that first area that I'm going to focus on, which relates to academic language, right? Even here, the term academic language sounds superior, right? Academic, implying that there are lesser forms of language that is not academic. Academic language instills this attitude in our students where there's sort of a superior language, a dominant language, a hierarchy of language where there is this standard English that is the correct way to speak, and all other languages, the languages spoken at home, is less than, right? So who gets to decide what is academic language and who isn't? And why is it that when we train our teachers in teacher education programs, we talk about the importance of academic language and English language development standards, right? Without recognizing that there's this implication that that language sounds like it's better than our students' home languages. There's also that area on the Padlet about who holds knowledge, right? Who actually is the holder of knowledge in the classroom? In teacher education, we love to talk about student-centered instruction. We say that that is the goal, that in the classroom, we need to train our teacher candidates to teach from a student-centered approach without actually realizing that what these teacher candidates will do once they step foot in the classroom is take student-centered instruction and translate that to cooperative learning, when that's not what student-centered instruction is, right? Student-centered instruction is realizing that not only the teachers hold knowledge, but your students hold knowledge too. And that they should be your partner, right? There should be a partnership between teachers and students in who has expertise in the concepts and how the concepts relate to your students' lives, right? Their own lived experiences. So it's about giving some of that power or taking some of that power away from the teacher and handing it to your students. And I don't think that teachers who teach from a student-centered approach actually realize that that's what student-centered instruction is. We also get into this third area of that Padlet, which focuses on the expression of emotions, which make me think of classroom management and this movement towards social emotional learning, which we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But it relates to what is the standard for student behavior and the expression of those behaviors, and what is that informed by? The next area relates to assessment, and we're going to talk about that in more detail a little bit later too. But that's really about, well, who gets to decide what is the best way for your students to demonstrate knowledge? Who decided on these standards of knowing, right? And the last area on that Padlet that I want you to really think about is this term, English learner, which is how the state of California labels them, right? And so therefore in teacher education programs, we have to work with our teacher candidates, our future teachers, to think about how to address the needs of quote unquote English learners in the classroom. But even that term has this sort of deficit cloud around it, right? these students are more than their language background. And not only that, but English learner implies that it's their only goal in life for like 12 years, kindergarten through 12th grade, to learn English. When in fact, we know that when students are bilingual, that they're actually like, they do quite well in school and there's a benefit to being bilingual, but we don't recognize that. We don't call that out, right? We say that the goal is to assimilate to English, to almost give up your native language and instead learn English. Why not call them dual language emergent bilinguals? Why not call them that, right? Because that's what they are. They're emergent bilinguals. They're learning two languages. Right now, English learners in the classroom are looked at as having a deficit. And sure, teachers might try to utilize the Heroes and Holidays approach to bring their culture into the classroom, but our English learners are more than their racial or ethnic background. And it's our job as teacher educators to understand that, to understand how deficit perspectives towards English learners and other students of color are anchored in white supremacy so that they can really explicitly confront it and support their candidates to construct lessons that go beyond stereotypical notions of race, ethnicity, or even students' content knowledge and background. You may have seen this before, but it's it's a revised version of everything that a student might have, right? There's this iceberg where up front and on top, what you see and what a teacher addresses aligns to things like their content knowledge background, what music your students listen to, who they see as a hero based on their race or ethnic identity, the way that they might dress, or the food that they might eat, right? But below that surface, once you get to know these students, you see that there are all these other areas that teachers don't really tap to. That is, they're too busy focusing on language. They don't see all these other wonderful, exciting areas about students' lives and their backgrounds that they can also address through the lessons that they teach, that they can also make attempts, that they can also try to connect to. So in revisiting that area of the Padlet relating to student behavior, right? I said I'd revisit that. Social emotional learning. A big focus on teacher education is this SEL, right? And in fact, I was talking to a superintendent the other day who said that they had gotten a $300,000 grant just to make sure that they have professional development around social emotional learning, which is defined as from the leading, one of the leading, I would say, organizations that has framed SEL, CASEL. Social emotional learning is a process through which children and adults understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. So it's actually quite deep, right? But what happens is this official definition often gets broken down into these categories, right? With what teachers try to use in the classroom, like usually it's in the morning: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. And what happens with these terms is they get watered down to a set of standards in those morning meetings, where rules like keep your hands to yourself and speak quiet, right? Quiet voices are overemphasized. But who defines how students should actually behave, or what demonstrations of social emotional learning are best? Where is affirming each student's identity and cultural background, their families and their communities? Where is the flexibility of allowing students to express themselves based on their family or community norms? Where is the understanding that some students have experienced trauma and because of it are unable to shed themselves of this trauma once they enter the classroom? Where is that recognition, right? Well, the good news is that if you were to ever do a unit on classroom management and you start exploring social emotional learning is in a foundational level type class, you can actually go to this organization site called the Center for Reaching and Teaching the Whole Child, because what they've done is they've taken Castle's version of social emotional learning and created the social and emotional and cultural anchor competencies framework, which takes students' cultural lives into consideration and intersects it with elements of social emotional learning so that those areas don't get forgotten. And that's an important thing. It's what we need to do as teacher educators is we need to help them see that the frameworks that they might be seeing in their professional development programs, through other instructors, through the curriculum that is given to them by their school district, they need to confront that and see if there are better versions out there that are beneficial to students who might feel that they are oppressed, right? So if you're gonna support students from an SEL approach, don't do it from a colorblind approach. Help your candidates understand that SEL alone supports white norms and have them approach SEL from a socio-political context and culturally relevant lens. That's the last area that I want to sort of discuss and focus on, which is really big in teacher education programs and how we train our teachers, relates to assessment strategies and the ways in which teachers and teacher education programs and teacher educators privilege and validate some forms of assessment over others. So for example, in the classroom, teachers often have students complete a worksheet, have students write a report or give a presentation or take a multiple choice test. And they see those strategies as one of the best ways to assess students. And they actually do that because in college, these are the go-to strategies for college professors, right? So you have these teacher candidates who go through K-12 and then go through higher ed, where these are the only assessment strategies that exist, to going back to K-12 where they're expected to utilize different approaches, right? But what's really interesting about this sort of validation of certain forms of assessment over others is that I think right now teachers are actually pretty good at teaching information in such a way so that they can differentiate their instruction from a visual approach, from an auditory or kinesthetic or collaborative approach. They know that learners prefer to take multiple paths and need multiple paths to learn instruction. And so teachers are actually really good at trying to differentiate their instruction in that way. But what I also notice is even though they're teaching content that way, they're differentiating it, at the end of the day, they're still assessing them one way. They still expect them to complete that worksheet or complete an exit ticket where the student has to write their response, right? It's a written assessment, right? There's usually only one way to demonstrate knowledge. Instead of giving students the opportunity to demonstrate knowledge based on what they can do best, right? The best way for them to demonstrate knowledge based on their own strengths. Teachers don't consider that. So teachers should consider how to support assessment from an anti-racist lens by thinking about how they can support their students in diverse ways of demonstrating knowledge. And as teacher educators, we need to help them understand how and why it's problematic for teachers to only teach through one form of assessment and have students, our candidates that is, sort of develop this student-centered assessment approach towards student evaluation that constructs assessments from student background and assets. So this is a lot of information, right? I know that if you maybe haven't seen it before, I mean, maybe you did in an earlier presentation, but you're going to get a lot of, I'm sure that with this, you've already gotten a lot of information. And if you've attended other webinars over the past couple months, there's a lot of conversation and movement towards anti-racist teaching and what anti-racist teaching practices actually look like. But what I notice is that with a lot of teachers, and especially white teachers, is that they see themselves as someone who really wants to do this work, but they don't know how to take that first step. They're scared to, they're afraid of making a mistake and hurting someone, hurting one of their students, right? And I would say that what's really important to understand is, you know how like there's, have you ever heard the term like first generation college student, right? So a first generation college student, right, is the first person in a family who goes to college. And, you know, they don't know the ins and outs in college, right? Because they might have not had that support. And they might be a little bit messy the first year, and they might make a lot of mistakes, like pick the wrong classes or not realize how intense it is or not do all the readings, right? But then they soon realize that, oh, okay, this is what I need to do their freshman, sophomore year. And then they get better and better and better until they graduate, right? That's sort of like the trajectory of a first generation college student. Well, I want, if this is like maybe your first year at thinking about what it means to be an anti-racist teacher, I want you to sort of think about, well, I want to see myself as a first generation anti-racist educator. So a first generation anti-racist educator, and this is borrowed from Estella Ben-Simon's framework in an article that she wrote. First generation anti-racist educators are people who are caring, right, about matters of anti-Blackness and white supremacy and want to confront it, but they realize that they have this limited level of racial literacy. And because of that, right, they do the work. They do the work on their own to read up and attend webinars and watch videos and learn about what anti-racist teachers should do, right? Written by and attend webinars completed by people of color who have these lived experiences. First generation anti-racist educators are also in a place where they need to develop this critical race conscious lens, right? If you are a teacher educator, then you are probably or have been a teacher in the past, or maybe a veteran, have been a veteran teacher, right? Well, what I notice about teachers who've been teaching for a long time is unless they have this critical lens or this critical race conscious lens, is they just sort of teach in a way that they're told to teach through their district, given with the curriculum that is given to them. But what a first generation anti-racist educator might do is they might look at that and they might think, okay, well, how can I confront this curriculum? How can I go beyond it and look at the ways that things are depicted in the curriculum from a race conscious lens so that I can then use that to, again, address those tenets of what anti-racist teaching is that I talked about earlier and support our students of color. They also don't have this clear knowledge of positionality. I think that with 84% of teachers being white and this discomfort that teachers have had with exploring concepts of racism and white supremacy and anti-Blackness, I think that what teachers need to do is they need to recognize that, well, there's a lot of privilege in that, unearned privilege, right? Just because they're white. And that because through that privilege, they've never had to think about it, but realizing that their students' lives, in their students' like this is something they go through all the time, right? So acknowledging that, okay, I'm a person who has this sort of unearned privilege that I've been benefited with for most of my life. Therefore, I need to think about what that means in the classroom. And then thinking about what it means to actually be equity minded. What does it mean to actually give and teach students in a way of based on where they're currently at? How do you move away from seeing your students as deficits, as having a deficit? How do you look at like race and class and language from a deficit lens and be more equitable and see that students are more than that, and that you should, as an educator, move towards more of an asset-oriented lens, and how that addresses this sort of equity framework that you might be teaching from. Because eventually what happens is you're going to move to what an anti-racist educator sort of does, right? And realizing that the work is never done and that it's really actually difficult work. It's difficult to do these things, to make these movements, and realize that it's not an endpoint. It's sort of like, it's like, here's the end, and you're going to always throughout your whole life try to get to this point. I learn stuff every day when I go on through the social media circles that I belong to, the people I follow on Twitter, the groups I follow or join on Facebook, the podcasts I listen to when I work out. Like, I learn new stuff every day about what anti-racist teaching actually is. And there's sort of like this checklist when you feel like you know that you're heading into the right direction. You make sure that you expose yourself to anti-racist resources written primarily by Black, Indigenous, or people of color. That's what BIPOC is, right? Because you realize that those are the people who not only can talk about these concepts from an expert and professional lens, but can do so with an intersection of their own lived experiences, which is important. They make room for critical self-reflection. They look at their own dispositions, their own values, their own beliefs, and they think about the ways in which those beliefs can be hurtful towards others, and they're critical about it so that they can then fix it. They reject deficit views, which you've already talked about. They advocate for equitable school and teaching practices. So you not only use these practices in your own classroom, but you try and start a movement in your school so that this is the norm, or this is the pattern that exists. You commit to dismantling racism, and you move yourself from an ally to standing in solidarity, right? An ally is someone who says, I support you. But someone who stands in solidarity is, I support you, and I'm going to go out and fight for you, and I'm going to fight with you, right? That is someone who stands in solidarity. So that is sort of all that I have today for my presentation. But I wanted to see if anyone had any questions or comments.
Daniel, I'm going to suggest we're such a small group that maybe we go to a gallery view and people can ask their questions of you,
Sure.
just, one by one.
Yeah, so you want me to stop sharing?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay.
And participants, turn your cameras on, and if anyone has a question, just chime in. We've had a couple of people that had to leave. So I think we have about 10 or so, 10, 12 people here. Anyone have a question?
Daniel?
Yeah.
Is it okay if I call you Daniel?
Yeah, of course.
So I'm an early childhood educator. So I'm looking at, I'm preparing teachers who are going to work with children under the age of 5.
Okay.
And everything that you have said, I believe applies to our field too. But one question that popped in my head, and hopefully I can verbalize it, is that when you were talking about assessing, that we're assessing or looking at assessing in one way, obviously there's a problem, there's problems with that, but giving students the opportunity to demonstrate their knowledge based on the student's strength.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe what you're saying is giving them a choice then to choose what they're giving them empowering them to decide what their strength is, first of all, rather than me deciding that, right? So for them to realize their strength and then to create a way that they can express what they have learned or what they know in that way.
Right.
So, okay, so I got I think I got that.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, but now my question is, can you give me an example of what that might look like? Because I have struggled with that idea. I believe in that idea.
Sure.
And I do try to give choice, and I do try to use a lot of different kinds of assessments. So we
Sure.
have really, in early childhood, many of us have gone away from using the typical multiple choice question, but we try to be more allowing them to be reflective or find some other way. But
yeah,
could you give us an example?
I mean, I would say, so I'm not when I was a teacher, the earliest grade I ever taught was second. So I want to be upfront in saying that my experience with ECE and anything that happens before second grade is a little bit like, I know about it a little bit, but I'm not expert at it in any way. But I would say that like when I hear, so it's not just about, so I think part of it is empowering your students so that they can have the opportunity to demonstrate knowledge based on their own strengths. But I would imagine that at such a young age, it's like they themselves don't know what their strengths are. So it becomes a job of the educator to get to know their students. And through observation and through that relationship building, kind of thinking, oh, okay, so-and-so is really good at this and so-and-so is really good at that, right? And then thinking about, okay, well, now that I know, based on knowing them, what their strengths are, I'm going to give them choices to demonstrate knowledge, but it's going to be like a set of choices that I know that that they can draw from based on what they know, what I know about them, right? So whether that is, if you ask your students a question, allowing them, even if it's just a discussion, right? You're having a discussion in your class, you ask your students a question, you might have some students that are really quiet, that don't want to speak up at all, right? Maybe perhaps because they're an English learner, right? Because their first language is in English and they're afraid that they're going to say something incorrectly, but giving them the option to where you're like, you ask the question verbally, you want students to, raise their hand and say the answer verbally. But what are you doing for those students who aren't comfortable with that? Are you giving them an option to where maybe they have a whiteboard and they can draw a picture that has the answer in it, or they can write it down somehow, or they can go up and maybe whisper it in your ear, right? Because they don't want to say it in front of everyone because they're scared of saying it, right? So they whisper it in your ear and then you say, oh, Michael just said something really great to me. So it's just giving them, it's just thinking about what your students, not only their needs are, but what their assets and strengths are, and then thinking about how assessment fits into that, and then giving them this sort of range of choice that allows them to sort of demonstrate knowledge based on that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
So yeah.
Next question.
So, Daniel, I have a kind of tricky question here.
Sure.
Everything that you say, I feel is so true in my heart and in my gut. And, I've been feeling this way for a long time. But then I always run up against people who have, the kind of resistance, but the way that they express their resistance is, again, through a white supremacy lens where they're saying, well, success does mean teaching our students academic language. And it does mean doing all of this stuff with the curriculum, which I believe our curriculum needs so much work because it doesn't really represent, first of all, the truth.
Right.
And second of all, it doesn't represent everybody else. But I always get stumped at that point. I find myself just kind of like stumbling over myself and not really knowing how to respond when they say, well, you're just being more racist because you're not teaching those students because their lens tells them that teaching them means imposing my view of what they should know on them. But that's their lens. And then I never know, I just get stuck. And I feel like I'm not as effective in dealing
Mhm.
with that question.
Well, let me say this. So let me just say that, like, I think that I got to give you props for at least making an attempt to talk to your colleagues or your friends who might have these sort of oppositional views from what you have, right? But I want to take those two examples that you spoke about, like academic language and imposing your views, sort of like thinking, oh, okay, my students need this, right? And then saying, oh, well, that's your view of what they need. How do you actually know, right? So I know that from like, but this is like based on my experience through the readings I've done and what I've learned through talking to people. But it took me a long time to get there. But for academic language isn't about saying that, well, I'm not saying teaching academic language is bad. But what I'm saying is that the terminology that we use in the field, right? Academic language, right? Um, that is problematic because it would mean, it implies that other words are non-academic, non-smart, less than, right? And so just kind of going back to like English learners, right? So sure, like there's nothing wrong with learning standard English, the rules of standard English, and there's nothing wrong with teaching students whose first language is in English. There's nothing wrong with teaching them that, hey, you need to have these skills to be successful in this country. There's nothing wrong with that. But you can do so in a way to where you're also lifting their home language. You can do so in a way that says, well, you know, you need to do this to be successful, but your home language is awesome. And we need to talk about both languages and how both languages are valuable, right? So it's like, imagine if you spoke to that colleague and you're like, well, this is how you should think about academic language. And having that conversation is like, they can't say anything bad about that, right? Because who's going to say that being bilingual is terrible, right? Because being bilingual, there's research that actually says
Right.
bilingual actually makes you smarter. And then there's that other perspective about imposing your views on others and saying that that's, you know, quote unquote racist, right? Well, it's not about, I would say it's not about thinking, oh, okay, you know, I have 3 Filipino kids in my class, therefore I'm going to assume that they self-identify with that cultural, ethnic, or racial identity, not racial, but ethnic identity, and I'm going to, you know, try to bring that identity into the classroom because I'm going to assume that that's happening. And I think that what people would say who do this type of work is, well, it's not about that. It's not about looking at your students and saying, oh, they're Filipino American, or oh, those students are Black, and so they think of the world this way, and those students are Mexican American. And it's not about that. It's about getting to know your students and how they self-identify with respect to their ethnic or racial identity. And then from that knowledge of once you know their students, then connecting that cultural resource, that cultural strength that they have to your lesson. So you're not imposing your views on your students based on your assumptions of race or ethnic identity. It's what you're doing is you're getting to know your students, and then you're saying, I'm going to teach my class based on what I know of them, right? So, but those conversations, right, can occur with most things that we talked about today that relate to anti-racist education, where you can have, where people will say, yeah, but, right? But a response to those questions comes with time and with reading the resources that you know, like getting, you know, I can send out a book list or a resource list of
That'd
people,
be great.
you know, that you could read from that would give you some of this knowledge so that you become more, right, more fluent, right? So remember that first generation equity educator, right, anti-racist educator, like if people saw themselves as that, as someone that, hey, I need to learn this, and then you took the time to learn it, then eventually you'll develop some expertise in it, and you'll be more comfortable, and you'll be able to be more fluent when it comes to concepts of race, right? You'll become more racially literate, right?
Right.
And that the only way you do that is with time and with this sort of reading on your own and learning on your own, and then you'll be prepared to confront those people and have responses a little bit better. And I think that for, I'm not going to assume that you're white, but if you are a white educator, that confronting your white colleagues is especially important, because sometimes I feel like when they hear it from me or other people of color, they're like, they start tuning you out because they're like, oh, you know, here comes another person, blah, blah. But if they hear it from someone that is from their own background, from their own race, then I sometimes feel like they'll listen a little bit more openly.
Right.
So
Yeah.
Right.
That's
Well,
great.
thank you. Thank you
Thanks.
so much, Daniel. We're going to be closing up shortly. I have 2 questions to ask, but I'll wait and ask those of you privately another time. But thank you so much for that explanation. And it just reinforces how we have to be more than allies, but we have to be accomplices among our like types that may not be people of color. So we really, really appreciate you being here today. Do you happen to have the last slide I sent you that has the evaluation link on it?
Oh, yeah.
Would you mind sharing that?
Yeah, let me share the screen again.
And there's your email address. So if anyone does have more questions, they may email you and ask you some specifics. We really appreciate that.
Yeah, there's my email address. You could also just type my last name, Sujinda. I mean, I'm like the first thing that pops up on Google because my last name's weird. Not weird.
Not weird.
And then, but yeah.
Okay. Great. I love how you all call yourselves CSU Stan. I mean, how you call yourself Stan in your community there. I'd not heard that before.
Yeah,
so,
Stan State.
Yeah, that's really cool. All right, well, great. Well, everyone, this is the evaluation QR code or survey QR code to give us feedback about your experience and what you learned. And we really appreciate if you fill that out. And once again, Daniel, thanks for your time. Thank you for putting so much thought into this. And I don't know, we're gonna have to do some other kind of seminar so that you can give us the nuts and bolts on how do we develop our future teacher candidates in those early foundation level classes into these first generation anti-racist teachers. I mean, there's layers of it. And there are things, we have to start with them in those early classes. So thank you so much. And have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. We'll see you in the next session. Miguel Zavala is speaking next if you want to hang around.
Okay.
All right. Take care.
All right. Bye.